One of the biggest disconnects men face in relationships comes from assuming that women process relationship events the same way men do. Men tend to experience situations linearly. Something happens, then it's evaluated, then responsibility is assigned. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Logic is the organizing principle. For women, the order is reversed. The emotional experience comes first, and logic is used later, if at all, to explain or justify how they feel. This difference alone explains why accountability feels so confusing for men in relationships. When a woman reflects on something that happened, she doesn't start with facts. She starts with how it made her feel. That feeling becomes the lens through which the entire situation is interpreted. If she feels good, events are remembered positively. If she feels bad, the same events may be reframed as mistakes, pressure, neglect, or incompatibility, even if nothing objectively changed. This isn't deception. It's emotional processing. Men often assume that responsibility means acknowledging actions independent of emotion. Women often experience responsibility as inseparable from their emotional state. If the feeling has changed, the story changes with it. From a male perspective, this feels inconsistent or unfair. From a female perspective, it feels honest. This is where most arguments begin. A man says, "But you agreed to this," or "You said you wanted that," or "We decided together." He's referencing a past logical agreement. She responds with how she feels now. And because the current emotion is stronger than the past agreement, the agreement loses relevance. Men get stuck trying to hold women to prior logic. Women feel misunderstood and emotionally invalidated. Both sides feel unheard. What men often label as avoidance of responsibility is actually emotional prioritization. If a woman feels disconnected, unsafe, or unhappy, she will naturally focus on resolving that feeling rather than examining who did what correctly. Emotional alignment matters more to her nervous system than factual accuracy. This is why asking a woman to just admit fault often backfires. It feels like an attack on her emotional reality. Even if the facts support the man's point, the delivery bypasses her emotional experience. Instead of cooperation, it triggers defensiveness. Strong men learn not to argue with emotional reality. They don't try to win logic battles inside emotional conversations. They understand that emotional truth comes first, and logical clarity follows only when emotional safety is present. This doesn't mean men should abandon boundaries or accept mistreatment. It means they stop expecting relationships to operate like courtroom proceedings. Relationships are emotional ecosystems. When emotion is dysregulated, responsibility becomes inaccessible. A grounded man observes patterns instead of demanding confessions. He notices behavior instead of chasing apologies. He adjusts his leadership instead of forcing verbal accountability. This is not weakness, it's emotional intelligence. When emotional safety exists, women often take responsibility naturally. Not through formal admissions, but through changed behavior, increased softness, and renewed investment. When safety doesn't exist, no amount of logic will produce accountability. Men who understand this stop feeling betrayed by female nature. They stop expecting women to process reality like men do, and in doing so, they experience far less frustration and resentment. You don't lead relationships by demanding logic. You lead them by understanding emotional order. Expand key point 2 in 600 words, any heading in flow speech naturally according to overall key points, and add only necessary ending line. Emotional justification replaces logical accountability. One of the hardest truths for men to accept in relationships is that accountability, as they understand it, is rarely how women process conflict. Men expect responsibility to look like admission, ownership, and consistency over time. Women often experience responsibility through emotional justification instead. What feels true emotionally becomes what feels valid, even if it contradicts past logic or agreements. This is where men feel like the ground keeps shifting beneath them. When a woman's emotions change, her interpretation of past events often changes with them. Something that once felt exciting can later feel rushed. Something that once felt mutual can later feel pressured. From a male perspective, this looks like rewriting history. From a female perspective, it feels like aligning the story with her current emotional truth. Men often ask, How can she say that now when she didn't feel that way then? The answer is simple but uncomfortable. Emotional reality is prioritized over chronological consistency. The present feeling becomes the filter through which the past is reinterpreted. This doesn't mean women are intentionally lying. It means emotional coherence matters more than factual consistency. If a woman feels unhappy now, her nervous system will search for reasons that justify that feeling. Those reasons become her truth, regardless of what was said or agreed upon before. Men try to counter this with evidence. Text messages, conversations, promises, timelines, but evidence doesn't dissolve emotion. In fact, it often intensifies resistance. When a man pushes logic against emotion, the woman feels invalidated, and when emotion feels threatened, justification becomes stronger, not weaker. This is why accountability conversations often go in circles. The man is arguing facts. The woman is defending feelings. They're not even in the same conversation. Men who don't understand this assume bad intent. They think she's avoiding responsibility, being manipulative, or refusing to be fair. That interpretation builds resentment. But the deeper issue isn't character, it's processing style. Emotional justification isn't about winning, it's about regulation. When a woman feels emotionally overwhelmed, her system seeks relief. Justifying her feelings provides that relief. Admitting fault without emotional safety would feel like self-betrayal to her nervous system. This is also why apologies that are forced or cornered rarely change anything. Even if she says the words, the behavior often stays the same. Why? Because the emotional state didn't shift. Without emotional resolution, logical admissions are empty. Men who lead well stop chasing verbal accountability. They stop trying to get her to admit it. Instead, they pay attention to outcomes. Behavior, energy, investment. Those are the real indicators of responsibility in emotional systems. When emotional safety is present, justification softens. A woman may not say, I was wrong, but she'll show it through closeness, softness, and changed behavior. That's responsibility in feminine form. When safety is absent, justification hardens. Words become defensive. Stories become rigid. Accountability disappears completely. No amount of logic can break through that wall. This is where masculine leadership matters. A strong man doesn't need verbal confession to move forward. He sets boundaries through action. He adjusts his investment. He leads the direction of the relationship instead of negotiating blame. Men suffer most when they expect women to resolve conflict the way men do. When they release that expectation, clarity replaces frustration. They stop arguing with emotional reality and start responding to it intelligently. Responsibility doesn't disappear in relationships. It just shows up differently than men are taught to expect. Expand key point 3 in 600 words, any heading and flow speech naturally according to overall key points, and add only necessary ending line. Men who demand accountability trigger defense, not resolution. One of the most common mistakes men make in relationships is believing that pushing for accountability will create clarity, fairness, and growth. From a male perspective, it makes sense. If there's a problem, you identify it, assign responsibility, and resolve it. But relationships don't operate like performance reviews, and demanding accountability often does the opposite of what men intend. When a man confronts a woman with the goal of getting her to admit fault, her nervous system doesn't hear solution. It hears threat. Not a physical threat, but an emotional one. Accountability framed as confrontation feels like judgment, exposure, or loss of safety. And when safety feels compromised, the natural response is defense. Defense doesn't look like calm discussion. It looks like justification, deflection, emotional escalation, or shutdown. The woman may change the subject, bring up past grievances, cry, withdraw, or flip the focus back onto the man. From his point of view, she's avoiding responsibility. From her point of view, she's protecting herself emotionally. This is where men get trapped. The more she defends, the more he pushes. The more he pushes, the more she resists. What started as a desire for resolution turns into a power struggle, and power struggles kill intimacy. Men often believe that if they just explain themselves better, use better words, clearer logic, more examples, she'll finally understand and take responsibility. But understanding isn't the issue. Emotional safety is. Without safety, no amount of logic will land. Accountability demands put women into a corner emotionally. Corners create walls, not cooperation. When someone feels cornered, they don't open up, they fortify. Even if she knows somewhere inside that she contributed to the problem, admitting it under pressure feels humiliating rather than healing. This is why forced apologies rarely lead to change. A woman may say, "I'm sorry," just to end the conflict, but nothing shifts internally. The behavior repeats because the emotional pattern was never resolved. The apology was compliance, not ownership. Men who understand female emotional processing stop trying to extract responsibility through confrontation. They don't interrogate feelings. They don't demand admissions. They don't try to win arguments. Instead, they observe patterns and lead through action. Leadership in this context means setting boundaries without debate. It means adjusting behavior and investment based on what's actually happening, not what's being promised or denied. If a woman consistently behaves in ways that create chaos, a grounded man doesn't argue about who's right. He decides what he will tolerate and acts accordingly. This approach often creates more accountability than confrontation ever could. When emotional pressure is removed, defensiveness drops. When defensiveness drops, self-reflection becomes possible. Responsibility arises naturally when someone feels safe enough to look inward. Ironically, the men who stop demanding accountability often receive more of it. Not in words, but in behavior. The woman becomes softer, more cooperative, more aware, because she's no longer fighting for emotional survival. This doesn't mean men should accept mistreatment or suppress their needs. It means they stop trying to manage outcomes through force. They understand that emotional systems respond to presence, not pressure. Strong men don't need confessions to feel validated. They don't need agreement to move forward. They trust their perception, honor their boundaries, and lead with calm certainty. That certainty creates the very environment where responsibility can exist. When men stop demanding accountability and start leading emotionally, conflict transforms from a battleground into a feedback loop. And in that space, resolution becomes possible. You don't get responsibility by demanding it, you get it by removing the need to defend. Expand key point 4 in 600 words, any heading and flow speech naturally according to overall key points, and add only necessary ending line. Responsibility is felt through safety, not admitted through words. One of the most misunderstood aspects of female nature in relationships is how responsibility actually shows up. Men are conditioned to believe responsibility looks like verbal ownership and apology, and admission a clear statement of fault. But for women, responsibility is rarely expressed through words alone. It's felt internally first and revealed externally through behavior, only when emotional safety exists. When emotional safety is absent, responsibility becomes inaccessible, not because a woman is incapable of it, but because her nervous system is focused on protection, not reflection. Accountability requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires safety. Without safety, the system locks down. Men often miss this because they focus on dialogue instead of environment. They think if they say the right thing, explain themselves clearly, or present logical arguments, responsibility will follow. But logic doesn't unlock accountability, emotional containment does. When a woman feels emotionally safe, she doesn't need to defend herself. She doesn't need to justify her feelings. She doesn't need to rewrite events. In that relaxed state, self-awareness naturally emerges. She may soften. She may change behavior. She may lean in more. She may even take ownership without being asked. That is responsibility in its natural feminine form. But when a man pushes for admissions, demands clarity, or frames accountability as a moral test, he removes safety. Even if his points are valid, the delivery signals judgment. Judgment triggers self-protection, and self-protection shuts responsibility down. This is why many men feel frustrated when a woman never admits fault. What they don't realize is that the environment they're creating makes admission impossible. Not because she's stubborn, but because her nervous system doesn't feel safe enough to be honest with herself, let alone with him. Responsibility for women is often demonstrated indirectly, through effort, through changed behavior, through renewed emotional investment, through softness instead of resistance. Men who demand verbal accountability often miss these signals because they're listening for words instead of observing patterns. A grounded man understands this difference. He doesn't need to hear, "I was wrong." to know what's happening. He watches whether behavior improves, whether chaos reduces, whether connection strengthens. Those outcomes matter far more than statements. This is also why strong men don't chase closure conversations. Closure is an emotional luxury, not a requirement. When a man is centered, he doesn't need verbal validation to move forward. He decides based on what's real, not what's promised. When safety exists, responsibility flows naturally. When safety is absent, responsibility is replaced by justification, defensiveness, or withdrawal. This isn't manipulation, it's biology. Men who learn to stop personalizing female resistance. They stop seeing it as disrespect. They stop trying to win emotional debates. Instead, they focus on maintaining a calm, grounded presence. They regulate themselves instead of trying to regulate her. And paradoxically, that's when responsibility begins to show up. Not because it was demanded, but because it was allowed. The man who understands this doesn't argue with reality. He creates conditions where truth can exist. He doesn't need to corner a woman into accountability. He lets safety do the work for him. Responsibility doesn't rise from pressure, it rises from emotional safety. Expand key point 5 and 600 words any heading and flow speech naturally according to overall key points and add only necessary ending line. Responsibility shifts when a man stops negotiating his boundaries. Key point 5 centers on a hard truth. Most men avoid light responsibility in relationships. Does not increase when you ask for it. It increases when you remove access to you without it. Many men unknowingly train women to avoid accountability by negotiating their boundaries instead of enforcing them. When a man explains, justifies, over-communicates, or repeatedly gives chances without consequence, he teaches a powerful lesson. Nothing actually happens if behavior doesn't change. Words become noise. Emotions become tools, and responsibility becomes optional. From a behavioral standpoint, accountability only matters when outcomes change. If a woman can disrespect, withdraw, test, or create chaos and still receive attention, reassurance, commitment, or emotional labor, there is no incentive for responsibility to emerge. Not because she is malicious, but because the relationship structure doesn't require it. This is where men confuse patience with weakness. They believe being understanding will inspire growth. In reality, over-understanding often removes pressure from reality. Growth requires friction, not arguments, but consequences. A grounded man doesn't punish. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't lecture. He simply adjusts his availability, investment, and energy based on what he experiences. If behavior aligns, access continues. If it doesn't, access reduces. Calmly, quietly, without drama. This is the moment responsibility becomes real. Not through emotional confrontations, but through loss of privilege. Many women don't consciously decide to avoid accountability. Instead, they follow emotional gravity. They move toward what feels stable, strong, and self-directed. When a man stops negotiating his standards and starts living by them, he becomes that gravity. What most men get wrong is timing. They wait until resentment builds, then explode with a "we need to talk." By then, the emotional tone is already adversarial. Responsibility is impossible in that state. The nervous system is defensive. The conversation becomes about feelings, not behavior. A man who understands female nature acts earlier and quieter. He doesn't announce boundary violations. He doesn't issue ultimatums. He simply responds to reality. Less texting, less emotional access, less prioritization, more space. This shift is often misinterpreted as coldness or withdrawal, but it's actually clarity, and clarity is attractive because it removes confusion. Here's the paradox: when a man stops asking for responsibility, he often starts receiving it. Because now the relationship reflects cause and effect. Actions matter. Energy has weight. And connection is no longer guaranteed. This is also why strong men are rarely argued with. There's nothing to argue about. The standard is visible in behavior, not words. Either you align or you don't. Either way, the man remains centered. When responsibility does appear, it often shows up subtly. A change in tone, increased effort, more consistency, less testing, less chaos. Men who are still addicted to verbal apologies miss this. But men who understand patterns recognize it immediately. And if responsibility doesn't show up, that's also information. Information that allows a man to make decisions without anger, bitterness, or self-betrayal. The goal is not to force accountability. The goal is to stop subsidizing irresponsibility. When a man values his time, energy, and presence, the relationship naturally reorganizes around that value. Responsibility either rises to meet it or fades out of the picture entirely, and either outcome serves him. Responsibility follows boundaries that are enforced, not explained. Expand key point 6 in 600 words any heading and flow speech naturally according to overall key points and add only necessary ending line. Emotional accountability only emerges when a man detaches from outcome. The final key point brings everything together. Emotional responsibility in relationships does not come from trying harder, caring more, or investing deeper. It comes from a man detaching from outcomes he cannot control. Most men unknowingly destroy accountability by making the relationship the center of their emotional identity. When a man is outcome dependent, every interaction becomes loaded. Texts matter too much. Responses are overanalyzed. Silence feels threatening, and any emotional shift from a woman creates anxiety. In this state, responsibility cannot exist because the woman senses that the man needs the relationship more than he needs his own self-respect. Female nature responds to emotional leverage, not manipulation, but leverage created by independence. When a man is okay whether she stays or goes, his emotional frame becomes solid. That solidity is what creates space for accountability to appear. Why? Because emotions seek containment. A woman unconsciously looks for a man whose emotional state is not easily disrupted. When she realizes her moods, reactions, or inconsistencies no longer destabilize him, a subtle shift happens. She becomes more self-aware. Not because she's forced to be, but because the environment now requires it. Most men chase resolution. They want clarity, closure, reassurance. They push conversations, revisit issues, and try to emotionally fix things. But emotional accountability does not emerge under pressure. It emerges under neutrality. A man who detaches from outcome does not disengage from standards. He disengages from emotional reactivity. He observes, he responds, not reacts. He lets behavior reveal intent rather than arguing about intentions. This is where many men get uncomfortable. Detachment feels like loss of control. But in reality, it's the return of control, internal control, the ability to remain grounded regardless of someone else's emotional weather. When a woman senses that a man's life, purpose, and emotional stability do not hinge on her validation, she adjusts. Sometimes she leans in. Sometimes she tests more. Sometimes she pulls away. All of it is information. And a detached man uses information, not hope, to guide his actions. Accountability shows up when emotional consequences are natural, not manufactured. If a woman disrespects and the man remains calm but reduces engagement, she feels the shift without being attacked. There is no argument to win, no narrative to twist, just a change in reality. This is why emotionally strong men rarely demand apologies. They don't need symbolic gestures. They look for behavioral alignment, consistency, effort, respect over time. Detachment also removes resentment. When a man expects a woman to behave differently than she is capable of, he becomes bitter. When he accepts reality and chooses accordingly, peace replaces frustration. Importantly, detachment is not indifference. It is presence without attachment, care without neediness, desire without dependency. A man who masters this becomes difficult to manipulate, guilt, or emotionally hijack. Not because he's guarded, but because he's whole. His identity does not shrink or expand based on relationship outcomes. At this stage, responsibility is no longer begged for. It either exists naturally or the relationship dissolves without chaos. And that is the ultimate power, the ability to walk forward unaffected, regardless of whether someone rises to your level or fades out of your life. When outcome no longer controls you, responsibility has room to exist or to expose itself by its absence.